Hi everyone, this is David Barr Kirtley, host of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing my first book, a short story collection called Save Me Please and Other Stories, which is available now on Amazon.com. And that's Save Me Please with please spelled P-L-Z. As you'll hear in today's show, the book contains some really cool illustrations. Some of the sample copies I've received from Amazon have looked great, and others have had illustrations that are too dark or had lines running through them. I've contacted Amazon about this repeatedly, and at this point I feel like I've done all I can do. If you receive a copy of the book that you're not happy with, you should definitely return it to Amazon for a refund. This is only an issue with the paperback version of the book. There's also an ebook version, and there are no issues with that as far as I know. So again, the book is called Save Me Please and Other Stories by David Barr Kirtley, and it's available now on Amazon.com. And you can learn more over at davidbarrkirtley.com. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 500 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. In this special bonus episode, we'll be discussing my first book, a short story collection called Save Me Please and Other Stories, which is available now on Amazon.com. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got our producer, John Joseph Adams. He's the editor of Lightspeed Magazine and the series editor of the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. And he's also edited more than 30 other anthologies. His latest project is the 3-volume dystopia triptych, Ignorance is Strength, Burn the Ashes, and Or Else the Light. So John, welcome back.
Always good to be here. Happy 500.
The next up, we've got Tom Grenzer, making his 25th appearance on the show. His short fiction appears in magazines such as Galaxy's Edge and in books such as New Voices in Science Fiction. He's the author of the business book Think Like Google and the short story collection Intergalactic Refrigerator Repairmen Seldom Carry Cash. And his popular science book How It's Made, written for the Discovery Channel, will be out later this year. So Tom, welcome to the show.
Happy to be back.
And also joining us today is Zach Chapman, making his 12th appearance on the show. His short fiction appears in Nature, Starship Sofa, Tales to Terrify, Steampunk Universe, and Writers of the Future. And he also edited the book Time Travel Tales, which includes stories by Catherine Wells, Sean Williams, and Robert Silverberg. So Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, so as we're recording this, I have a draft of this book, which is, I think, pretty much final. And so I will be submitting that soon. And so I just sent it to all you guys. So John, just overall, what do you think of this book? How excited about this are you?
No, I mean, I'm really excited, actually. You know, I mean, it's I always love it when an author that I'm a fan of has a collection out finally. In some cases where it's like sometimes it goes fast, sometimes it goes slow. For you, it's been a long time coming. So I'm really glad to have a place where people can get all your stories in one place. You know, looking over the table of contents and everything, it was like, man, a lot of these stories, I mean, basically all of the stories are like very memorable. Like, it's like you gave us a little synopsis of each one, but I'm like, you know, it was almost not even necessary because it was like your stories are so distinct, and that's pretty rare actually that I could like look through a table of contents and titles and be like, oh yeah, no, I know which one that is. You know, even for an author I know quite well. So anyway, yeah, super excited about it.
Yeah, so I guess I'll explain. So this book contains 20 stories. And it's stuff that I published, you know, starting when I was in college and going up to the most recent things I've written, which are, you know, about 10 years ago now. So between the ages of sort of 21 and 33 is when I wrote all these stories. And you said, yeah, this has been a long time coming. I always sort of assumed that someone would give that my stories were so great that at some point somebody would be like, here's $100,000 for your book.
That's usually what happens. Yeah. But
then, yeah, it's like I don't just write about fantasy worlds. I also live in one. But yeah, so then it had been about 10 years and no one had made an offer like that. So I started considering other options. And so then there was this sort of precipitating event for this collection, which involves Tom. So Tom, why don't you talk about what was your experience with your short story collection?
Yeah, so very similar to you, Dave. we kind of came up together. I guess we can talk about that later. Came up to really not very high, but I'm talking about myself, not you. But anyway, I was kind of like at one point thinking recently, I should have I've got all these great short stories. They kind of are all like vanished. They were all published and now they're not published. And so I thought, well, no, I think I'll look at, I had done this business book, self-published that on Amazon, and it had done fairly well. And I thought, well, I should do that with my short stories. So I did. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go on some podcasts or something and talk about it. And you had been inviting me on Geek's Guide for quite a while, and I always enjoyed coming on here and talking about things. But I knew that I didn't want to impose, so I didn't even mention it to you. I don't think I think I might have said like, oh, I've got a short story collection out, but I didn't say like, oh, gee, can I be on Geek's Guide?
You asked me for feedback on the cover design. I think that was the first thing I saw.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay. So yeah, I wasn't trying to drop hints or anything. I knew you have, you have really good insights into things. And, especially when it comes to science fiction and fantasy. So I did seek your opinion. And then all of a sudden out of the blue, you were like, hey, you want to come on Geek's Guide and talk about your collection? And I was just blown away because I was like, that is like a dream come true. I would love to do that. And then we went, we talked about the collection and I thought, well, that'll, maybe I'll sell 10 or 15 copies or something. And lo and behold, like the next day after it came out, after the episode aired, I was just blasted with sales. It was, do you remember how many sales?
Yeah.
Like I sent you an email and I was like, holy cow, Dave, look at this.
Yeah.
Remember how many it was?
Yeah. Well, I have it here because I wrote about it in the book, but it was 200 within the first 24 hours and then 400 within the next 2 weeks and 600 within, I don't know, like a month or two.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is now. It's probably higher than that now, but.
Yeah, it probably is because I sell, like you said in the I think it was the afterward to the book, I sell 1 or 2 copies a day still. And it's all, like you said, it's all from the Geek's Guide appearance because I haven't promoted it whatsoever in any way. So yeah, I was really great. I was so grateful that you asked me to be on to talk about it. And then I was blown away by how many copies sold. And I was really glad when you said you were going to do a collection of your own after that, okay, great. Cause you spent so much blood, sweat and tears building this. What I told you was, it's the biggest science fiction and fantasy platform in the world, I think. And maybe I'm wrong, but as far as like trying to sell short fiction, I don't think there's anything bigger than this in the world. So yeah, I was really glad to see that you coming out with a collection.
Yeah, and I was really happy to, I mean, you've gotten like 25 reviews on Amazon and stuff. And so it was just like cool to see, that I could single-handedly basically, take a short story collection and I deserve all the credit pretty much for the book, I would say.
Oh, you do. I mean,
that's really where I'm going with this. But
you're joking, but there's no way I would have sold even, I don't know, like 5 copies. My mom is dead, so she wouldn't have bought one. But no, I don't think I would have sold anything without Geek's Guide for sure.
Yeah, so it's just like that's kind of a dream come true for me that I could, like take a book and make it just sort of like a success, kind of all on its own. So that's been really cool. And so yeah, and then I was totally flabbergasted that happened. Like you, Tom. I thought, oh, maybe he'll sell 20 or 25 copies, maybe like best case scenario, So yeah, so that's all been cool. And so then yeah, and really, my parents were like, okay, you have to do a collection now, And I was like, I don't have time. I do this podcast every week. I have no time to do anything. But I was like, all right, well, I'll take December off. I took 5 weeks off. That was supposed to be my vacation. I basically spent the whole time working on this book, which maybe I can go into in a bit how much more time consuming than I expected it turned out to be, even with various people spending a lot of time helping me out with it too. But I want to get Zach in here too. So Zach, kind of just, you've seen this final draft and everything, kind of what's your reaction to this?
Yeah, book? Well, overall, obviously super impressed. And you had invited me on and I had remembered, I thought, I'd read maybe 3 of these stories, but it turns out like, I think I'd actually read maybe more than half a dozen of these. And I was getting this like this super weird like nostalgia because, you know, I had read a lot of these John Joseph Adams anthologies, you know, I don't know, a decade ago. And also, year 1, maybe 2 of Lightspeed I was reading back then. And I mean, I don't read nearly as many short stories as I used to. So this was like, I was getting like this weird nostalgia, and I was like, oh man, this is like, I could tell where I was. Like, you get those like these weird memories of like, oh my God, like I remember reading this in my old apartment, like living in San Antonio, like right after I graduated college, or maybe I was still in college reading the Skull-Faced Boy in the back of The Living Dead, that first one. And then I don't think I ever read that sequel, but then, you know, I read it for the show, and yeah, it's just so I had an interesting reaction to it. I obviously I'm very excited about it, but I had familiarity with quite a few of these stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's obviously it's really nostalgic for me too, going back to these stories, because as I said, you know, I was 21 or so when I wrote the oldest of them. And then also one thing that's really cool about this book is that a lot of these stories were published in magazines and websites and stuff that did really nice art for the stories. And so I was able to get permission, thankfully from all 13 artists that I reached out to, I was able to get permission to include the art in the book. So this book has just amazing art. I can't think of any short story collection that has like art like this.
I'll go
except
along
maybe
with
it's
that.
maybe
It's stunning. I hadn't seen much of the art, or I think I read a lot of these. You just like emailed them to me or whatever, but I was blown away by the art. I was just like so impressed. You're right. It's so cool to have a short story collection have art like this in it.
Yeah, and it always just because I when I was a kid, I was really into writing and I was really into drawing, and I sort of at one point I had to choose, and I went with writing, but I've always really been into drawing and art and stuff, and I always just was so excited when they would do this artwork for my stories, and especially like magazines like Realms of Fantasy that would do just these beautiful full color, full page illustrations for the stories, and I always loved those so much, and then I was always really surprised that other writers, they would have stuff come out in Realms of Fantasy and they wouldn't like put the art up on their website or anything, and I feel like like I'm saying, I can't even like think of any other short story collection like this where there's, where they've taken the art from all the different stories from all the magazines and websites and stuff over the years and put them all together with the stories in the book. Like if anyone can think of an example, but it just surprises me more people don't do that because the art's already there.
Well, I think part of the issue with that is probably just like sort of when it's a publisher doing it, they're thinking like, oh, well, the rights are going to be hard to wrangle, or like, the artist is going to ask for X amount of money that we don't want to spend, and like if they're an established publisher, even if they're small, they don't want to like ask for it for free or anything. Whereas like if you're just a guy who's self-publishing a collection and it's like they did this art for these stories already, maybe they would be more willing to just like let you use it for this collection. Maybe you'll end up selling a ton of copies and they'll be like, oh, I wish I had asked for some money for that, but I don't know if you did pay the money, but yeah, anyway, that's what my thought is logistically it's another layer of complexity to a book.
No, all the artists said go ahead. I didn't pay anyone anything. I mean, if the book is if it's like a huge success, maybe I'll come back to them and be like, hey, I'll spread the wealth around. But
here's a nickel.
Well, because this is the thing, is that short story collections usually don't sell very well. And so as I sort of talk about this in the afterword a little bit, but most short story collections, if they're from a big publisher, the big publisher is just kind of doing it usually just to keep the author happy and hope that their next novel, makes the real money. Or they'll come out from small presses, but then small presses obviously don't have budgets for like art and cover art and all that kind of stuff. And if I had to, and all this art, as I said, it already existed. But if I had to commission all this stuff, like if it didn't already exist, I mean, it would have cost somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, $7,000 to $10,000, to hire all the artists to do all this art. So I was just really, really lucky that that all these stories had been published in so many magazines where, they had professional like art direction and, reached out to professional artists. And yeah, so I'm just so happy. And especially like how the layout was done with, like the art's like full page in this book and full, some of them are 2-page spreads and stuff.
Yeah, it's actually kind of reminiscent of like when something appeared in Realms of Fantasy or something. Like that's how the front, the first page of a lot of the stories in Realms of Fantasy would look.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that. Before we get too far afield from the comments about nostalgia, I was going to say also, it's interesting that Zach said that because, a lot of the stories themselves are also nostalgic for like you as the author, right? Because, there's stories like, Red Road, which is, sort of related to, certain books that you read when you were younger, and then like Transformations, Cats and Victory, probably plenty of them in here, but that is a consistent theme in a lot of your work where, you're sort of paying homage to, something that you loved when you were younger.
Yeah. And I talk about that in the introduction. So hopefully people read that before they get to the stories, and then it explains like what these things are all references to. And then also some of them were written for theme anthologies, like John had an anthology set in the Edgar Rice Burroughs Barzoom world. So I wanted to make sure somewhere it explains that before people got to the story in case they weren't familiar with that world. But yeah, a lot of them, when I was a kid, I just loved Saturday morning cartoons. Like you mentioned, like Thundercats and Transformers and stuff like that, and the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. And so I used to go down to the basement where our TV was. Most days my parents had to drag me out of bed to go to school and stuff. But then on Saturdays, I would wake up at like 4:30 in the morning, and I would go down to the basement, to get ready for the cartoons. And back then, there was nothing on that early in the morning. It was just a test pattern. There's just there's these multicolored stripes. And so I would just turn that on. I would just stare at the test pattern for hours, waiting for the cartoons to come on.
So that's what happened to you.
But yeah, so a bunch of these stories, are sort of riffs on sort of my feelings about some of those things that I loved so much.
I love the Transformers one, by the way. I'd never read that, Transformations. I didn't know you wrote that. And then when you said it was like based on Transformers, I was like, oh yeah, that's clear. But reading it was so much fun because that did give me a lot of nostalgia for watching Transformers. Not when I was a kid, because I was kind of like a bit older than you, but I was kind of a little bit warped as well. So I'd be like, 17 years old and being like, I'm watching Transformers. I hope nobody catches me. But no, it was so much fun reading it, and you had such a cool twist on it, which is kind of one of the things I hope we get into. That, I think I come up with a lot of cool ideas for short stories, but I don't really know what to do with them. But when you come up with a cool idea for a short story, you really spend so much head scratching time figuring out like, okay, this is a cool idea, but how do I make it into a really cool short story? So such a cool twist on the whole Transformers show. I won't dig into it too much right now, but I just loved how you thought through like, how would this be a really fun, fascinating story?
Yeah, well, I think we could say, the basic premise is it's like, what if you were friends with a Transformer as a kid, and then as you grow up, like what happened? Like, how does that relationship or that, that dynamic, how does that change at the different stages of your life?
What I like about it is like, it's this more mature take on like those, the kind of innocent times of like those innocent cartoons. And the same thing with Cats and Victory, which I didn't get when I first read it, that it was like Thundercats. I was thinking more along the lines of like Planet of the Apes. That's kind of like,
there's a huge Planet of the Apes influence as well. Yeah.
But yeah, like those stories. We recently watched like all that He-Man stuff, and it's kind of missing a bit of humanity to it, or like a bit of mature humanity to it. And so that's what I really like about these stories, is that you're still getting like those fun, like all of the building blocks that are really fun about those Saturday morning cartoons, but then like the maturity of like, and I'm not saying like maturity like the Transformers 2007 movie was like, not like that, it's more So there's more meat to it. It's, you're dealing with actual themes instead of just
you're digging into the existential side of it. Like I loved how it was like what it was all about, the transformer being able to transform from a vehicle into a robot, but then it was also about the kid, how he goes through these transformations, this big transformation in his life. And I loved how you kind of put that theme in there. It made it such a rich story.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to mention too that each story has an author's note, and part of the reason this book took so long to put together is because I was like, I'll just write a 2 or 3 page author's note for each story, not really thinking like, when you do that for 20 stories, that's a lot of writing, So it's like 18,000 words or something of commentary that was just written specifically for this book. And Zach was just mentioning the Cats and Victory story, and I'm particularly proud of the author's note for that story. I just think it's so funny, and I've just been going around just reading it to people.
Oh my gosh, that was my. I wrote that down. The you were glad that it wasn't consigned to the litter box of history.
Yeah.
that was hilarious.
I have to say, Dave, I'm a little disappointed that the art you featured was that amazing piece that is in there instead of the illustration that you did for it as a child. That was your initial basis for this story.
Yeah, so I guess I'll explain if you haven't read the book. Is that so? Cats and Victory was a series of picture books that I did when I was literally 3 or 4 or something. Before, when I was in preschool, and people would say, and it was just, it was very influenced by Saturday morning cartoons. And it's just like awesome cats, because I'm more of a cat person. It was just like awesome cats killing stupid dogs. And so I went back to it as an adult, 30 years later, and I was looking at it and I was like, oh my God, this is so such a horrible message, such a horrible subtext here. Why was I writing this kind of stuff? And it was because obviously I was thinking it was the influence of Thundercats, because that's all about beautiful cats killing or fighting pathetic frogs and jackals and stuff like that. And so I kind of reconfigured that so that the cat type characters are sort of these religious fanatics bent on eradicating all the other species, and it's a post-apocalyptic sort of thing. But also the other funny thing is that when I was a kid, I would make these Cats and Victory picture books sort of, and then I would make action figures and sell them to my friends in daycare, and it eventually came out that that some kids were skipping lunch and they were spending their lunch money on my action figures, and so then the school shut me down and they said I wasn't allowed to sell stuff in school anymore. So all that stuff's in that. Yeah, go ahead.
I love that story. I'm blanking on the name, but there's a female author from the 1950s or something who wrote all these I want to say Henry Huxley or something like that.
Oh,
That's not it. But anyway, he's always getting into scrapes like that where he figures out some way to make money, and that's exactly something he would have done. Henry Huggins, that's exactly something he would have done. Is make up a cartoon and sell it to his friends and then get busted and get told you can't do this anymore, you're taking all the kids' lunch money. But I think it's cool that you did it, that you even back then you were interested in entertaining other people with things that you create. That's just so cool.
Yeah, well, and I mean, self-publishing, that kind of ties into self-publishing this book, because I was thinking how perfectly situated I am to self-publish this book. I made a little list here, but it's you think about all the things that you would want a publisher for, and I kind of don't need them at this point, just given my skill set and my platform and everything. But it's I mean, one of the biggest reasons you would want a publisher is just that people are oh, if the author just self-published this, maybe how do I know it's any good? Maybe the author thinks that's good, but who else? Nobody else is, given this a vote of confidence. But since this is a short story collection and the stories were all published in all these different magazines and anthologies and stuff, I counted up that there are at least 23 different editors who, of their own free will, chose to include these stories in their magazines and anthologies. So, if you are concerned, did other people like these stories? Definitely that's the case.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because like I mean, totally that makes sense, and it's funny because I think a lot of people they always really want an original story or several original stories in a collection when a collection comes out, and I'm like, I don't want the original stories in there. Like, this is a collection of stuff that, like, publish it somewhere else, you know. And it's like even before I became an editor, it's like I was sort of or well, when I was an editorial assistant, I should say, I was working in editorial, but I wasn't an actual editor. I would see those stories, and I kind of had this vibe like, well, I mean, they couldn't sell that story anywhere else, right? That's why they put it in their collection by as an original. It's like, hey, I want some editorial stamp of approvals in there, you know.
I was going to ask if you wanted to include any originals. I mean, you had mentioned how many stories that you had written that that just got rejections. So that's, I mean, were there any ones where you're like, I really just want to throw this in here, but then decided not to for
I figured
reasons.
So this book almost collects all my stuff that I published as in college and later, and that added up to 300 and like over 350 pages. And I'm like, that's long enough for a short story collection, so I didn't want to like make it any longer than that. But yeah, I mean, I have so much stuff because I was writing, from the time I was a real little kid. And, I had written probably like 50 or something stories even before I graduated from high school. So I have this massive backlog of material, and most of like the stuff from high school, like a lot of it I probably wouldn't publish at this point, but a lot of it I think is really good. But I was kind of thinking, well, if this, let's put out this book, and this will be like, kind of like all the published stuff, you can have it all in one place. And then if people like this, then I mean, like I would try to maybe put together another book where it's like the stuff I published in high school, a lot of which I think is really, really pretty good. And then stuff that I wrote later that didn't get published, but easily could have. Like there was one story I was just, in the process of putting together this book, I was looking through all my rejection letters. And there was one story where, and I'd forgotten about this, but I had sent it to this big magazine. And the editor had said like, oh, I want to buy this. I just need to run it by the owner of the magazine. And it sounded like just, a formality to me. I thought I'd told the story, but then he came back and said like, oh no, the owner doesn't want to include it. But it's like, okay, well, that's a story that at least, one professional editor thought was good enough to put in the magazine. So it's certainly good enough to put in my, sort of backup, my second string collection. So yeah, that's what I would.
You should call it second string stories.
I think Joe Lansdale has one called Bumper Crop, which I thought was funny, and he did that one after he did like it was High Cotton, and it was High Cotton, and that was like his best stories, and then he did Bumper Crop, which I actually like more than High Cotton, and that's just like the leftovers, and it's like not nearly as thick, but.
Tobias Buckell had a collection. I forget the title of it, but it's like the premise is it's all these stories that didn't sell, and then he has a little essay about like why this didn't sell and what he's learned subsequently. And it's it's intended for writers to sort of help you understand how to make your writing more publishable. So I mean, definitely there will be another collection if this does well. I could definitely put together another collection that's pretty much, I think, pretty close to as good as this one. Or at least like if you liked this one, you would probably like the other one.
I would like to chime in on the quality of the stories because because I think I've always kind of thought of you as a writer who, and we were at Clarion together, and we both went to Colby College, although not at the same time. But then we hung out a lot after when we were both still trying to kind of break in and make sales. We kind of made a point, even though you lived in New York and I lived in Maine, we made a point to hang out once in a while and visit each other. And I've always kind of thought of you as a really hardworking writer who just doesn't let anything see the light of day unless it's like really awesome, which I think also makes you less prolific because you have such a high standard that like you're not going to let anything out versus me where I'm like, that's good enough. I'm going to kick that out the door. And which is why people like, I saw Fred Ollinger, another Clarion student at the same time as us. I saw him comment recently on one of your posts, I think about this book, where his only comment was something like, you're such an exceptional writer. And I was like, yeah. And Fred is such a harsh critic. He's so like, I remember, I don't think he liked hardly anything in that Clarion class. Out of the 19 or whatever students that were there, he just like hammered on everything except your stuff. And he's still to this day, like for him to like come back and comment like, decades later, yeah, you're such an exceptional writer. And I'm like, that's just because you spend so much time like thinking. And I remember you telling me this, like, well, if you're not satisfied with the story you're writing, it's probably because you just haven't thought it through enough. And you really do spend a lot of work thinking things through. And I think it does make you slightly less prolific, although you are more prolific than I am, but it makes you slightly less prolific than I would want, just because, but it's like a trade-off, right? It's like, well, your stories are so good, I want more of them. But then it's like, well, you can't have more, because if you just were like churning these out all the time, they wouldn't be as good. So I just wanted to throw that in. If anybody's listening is wondering, like about the quality of the stories or whatever, it's exceptional. Everyone is so well thought through, and everyone is so full of surprises, and just treats the subject matter as well as it could possibly be treated. So,
well, and like Dave was saying, all of these stories sold to professional editors, and what I think I was just counting. I think I published originally like 6 of them, at least 6 of them. Maybe I'm missing one, and then I reprinted several of the other ones. So
wow.
Obviously, like I have edited a lot of anthologies. I've had Lightspeed going for 10 plus years, and all kinds of things like that. And so it's like, if you trust my editorial opinion on all of that stuff, then you should trust that Dave is a good writer.
Yeah. Well, and John was such a big, part of my life and my career, as I say, that I actually included a little like second introduction just about how I met John.
Yeah.
So John, what was your take on that?
Oh, that was just really that was very touching, and like the book is partially dedicated to me as well. And so it's just nice that that sort of that our sort of friendship made such a big impact on your life, not just as a friend, but also as a writer. It was really cool to sort of revisit that through your your little introduction.
Well, and I just figured like you show up, your name pops up in so many of the author's notes for the different stories.
Yeah.
It's like people are going to be like, wait, who is the, I was like, I have to just explain like how we met so that people are like,
right.
Like they know who I'm talking about, whether like that this guy shows up over and over and over again. And
right. Yeah, I remember when we first met at the SIFWA meet and greet thing, or the Mill and Swell as they called it. And like you introduced yourself to me, and I had just seen your story in Weird Tales come out, and I'm like, oh, I thought your name was Donald, and then you were like, oh yeah, they got my name wrong in the magazine.
I remember that.
And so yeah, that always stuck with me because I was like, oh,
yeah, pretty much like a lot of my early pro sales, like they got either my name or the title of the story wrong.
Oh,
like either in the table of contents or in the like on the actual story.
Right.
It was just over and over again. And that's another thing. Maybe I'll go back here to my list of like why I'm in a good position to self-publish these things, is that I'm super detail oriented. And so I don't really need a copy editor, because like I 100% guarantee you that this book has fewer typos than your average book from a major publisher.
Yeah, I haven't found any. And I think I read one of the slightly earlier drafts from like a couple of weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like, there's totally the copy's clean. Oh, I have, thanks to John, I have professional experience writing book jacket copies. So
yeah.
I can do that.
Well,
and also the author notes too. Like you wrote the author notes for some of my anthologies.
Yeah. Go ahead, Zach.
So for this, like the amount of editing, you seem like you were just completely slammed and you said you took off over a month. So I know that these were already edited, but were you, and that you had to write about 18,000 words or however many words that you wrote for the notes and the intro, the 2 intros. I'm wondering, did you do any other edits, like other than, well, you would have to edit those notes, but then like aside from like line edits, did you do anything kind of substantial to these stories? Did you feel like These are like some of them over a decade old, right? Where you like I want to do more than just a line.
Yeah, no, I sort of like revised all the stories. Like I didn't, so I spent a couple of weeks doing that. Yeah, so a lot of I reworked a lot of the sentences and word choices and punctuation and stuff like that. I tried to like keep the editing light enough that if you just like read it one, you read the old one and then the new one, you wouldn't consciously notice any differences. Like to not completely rewrite any of the things, because I do want them. They are like, I want you to be like, oh, this is something I wrote when I was 21, and you can see what it's like or whatever. But the most significant, but it was hard because like, yeah, some of the like the biggest one I had issues with was the second rat, because I wrote it when I was 21, and it concerns a guy who's sort of goes forward and backward through time, and so he ages to be 34 and then like goes back again and so on. And so there's just a lot of stuff about adult life that I just didn't know when I was 21, and arguably don't know now, but I know more.
Maybe he was a podcaster.
Yeah.
So that one was the one I was like, I wanted to change the most. And I always thought of that as one of my best stories. So I didn't want to mess around with it too much. But I definitely
that's so funny that you say that story, because like while I was reading that, I edited time travel tales, and if I had read this story, I would have reached out to you and been like, can I get this in time travel tales? Because that story's it's awesome. It's everything that I like in a time travel story. So that's a big surprise that that's one that you felt like that you needed to, well, maybe you fixed all the problems because I didn't. I wasn't concentrating on the things like, it was more of a human story. Like he's thinking about his kid, and
it wasn't like the plot is great. It was more stuff like there was like one scene where it just like went back and forth between referring to something as a hotel room and an apartment. And I think when I was in college, the distinction was a little bit like vague to me. But now having lived in a lot of apartments, I can I'm like, no, this is not a apartment, this is a hotel room. And then the other thing is with the story of the prize. I can't go into it too much without spoilers, but there's like a character who shows up at the end who it's like, why doesn't this character should show up at the beginning to give it some symmetry? And there was something else at the beginning I wanted to change too. So I added like I took some stuff that was exposition and made a little scene with some dialogue, and it's only like, I don't know, 5 or 6 lines probably, but that's probably the biggest change I made to any of the stories that I can think of. But yeah, so let's see, have I finished my whole list here? Let's see. Oh, and then I one of the big things that held me back, honestly, from publishing, because I feel like I probably could have sold this to a small press, at any time in the last 10 years, but one of the things that kind of held me back is that so many small press books, I just like don't like the covers at all. And I would just be mortified to have my book come out and have just like a cover that I didn't like. And so with this, I was able to like sort of basically design the cover myself. Actually, we should talk, John, about Matthew, because John recommended this. The guy who did the layout and cover design and everything for me was this guy, Matthew Bright, who John recommended. So do you want to just say, John, how did you connect with Matthew in the first place?
Well, he actually has a story that he wrote that was in the Queers Destroy Horror special issue of Nightmare. And just to give some context for that, we Lightspeed did a thing called Women Destroy Science Fiction, which was an all women special issue that was in response to somebody saying women destroy science fiction by putting their girly cooties into stories and all that. You can look up destroysf.com if you want to see what the heck I'm talking about. But that turned into a long-running series. And so anyway, so he had a story in there, and his bio said something about, this sort of graphic design work that he does. And so I'm pretty sure we ended up having him work on that issue as a graphic designer, because we those were some of the few issues of Lightspeed that we actually released or Lightspeed and Nightmare that we released in print, because normally it's just a digital magazine. So obviously we need to have people who know how to do print layout and everything. And so he started working with us around then, and I've just used him for a bunch of different projects over the years because, I know he does good work. I know I can afford him. And so yeah, I mean, that's how it's
Yeah.
been, for years and years, and he stays, stays consistent and available. So it's nice.
Yeah, and if you want to check out his website, it's inkspiraldesign.co.uk. But so I had this sort of specific thing I wanted for the cover. I think I might have. Did I send that to you, John, and say like, could you do this or?
Yeah.
Yeah. But basically, so the collection, I felt like I had to call it "Save Me, Please" and Other Stories. The only other title that I thought would work well for a collection was The Skull-Faced Boy and Other Stories, but then I felt like that sounds too much like it's all horror stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go with Save Me, Please and Other Stories. So I want the cover to have something to do with Save Me, Please, which is the story sort of, not to give too much away, but kind of about a character who kind of gets trapped in a video game sort of situation. And so for years, I had this idea for an illustration for it where the main character would be kind of floating in the air and with her arms kind of outstretched. And it would almost look like she was crucified or like being, dissected on a table or something, like that kind of pose. And then, she would have this sort of haunted look in her face. And then there would be like kind of lines coming out of her hands leading to a sword and a wand. And it would kind of look like the whole thing would kind of look like a character sheet, because it's like a fantasy role-playing game in the story. And so I was like, okay, and I always thought like, oh, that's what I would want for the cover. And then I sit down and try to like actually do that. And I was like, okay, none of this doesn't fit at all. Like where are you going to put the title? Where are you going to put the author's name? Like it needs to be like way more compact than that. And even just like fitting in a character because I'm like, okay, it has to be a character holding a sword and a wand. And even just getting those simple things on the cover was surprisingly difficult. And I got to the point where I was like, okay, I see why so many of these small press books have kind of crappy covers, because it's really a lot of work to get something that doesn't look bad. I mean, I spent like basically an entire week and a half or something, just like with Matthew kind of going back and forth on the cover, trying different things. But I had made this little mock-up of and so the idea I had was, okay, what if she has her arms crossed in front of her? And then you can kind of get the person and the sword and the wand into this computer screen, because I want it to be she's on this computer screen. And so we went through all these iterations, and it was to the point where I was like, okay, now move this down 10 pixels and make this 10% more green and all this kind of stuff. So if you don't like the cover, it's totally 100% my fault, like, because I micromanaged everything about it so much. But like the thing I liked about it is that I wanted it to convey like that the book has fantasy stories and science fiction stories and horror stories, and that it's kind of like fun and funny too, in addition to being horrifying. And so you have this figure on the cover with holding the sword and the wand, and then she's on a computer screen, so that kind of gives you the science fiction vibe. And then there's this sort of stylized spider web in the background, so that kind of gives you the horror vibe. And then she kind of is done in sort of a cartoon style, so that gives you the sort of the cartoon stuff and the sort of fun adventure kind of stuff. So I think that like if I think the cover does a good job of conveying the sort of mood or the nature of the stories inside the book, which I think is what a good cover ought to do.
There's one thing I want to add to that you didn't mention, surprisingly, because you went into a lot of detail there. The typography is very, very well set on that. There are a lot of professionally published books that don't have nearly that kind of craft on laying out type. I'm a failed graphic design student. I dropped out of graphic design, but I still do like a lot of I do lettering, which is not nearly as difficult as typography, like laying out a cover. But that is something that was so impressive to me, the way he worked those words together, "Save Me, Please," and that the different angles and how readable and how bold it is. It's just
Yeah.
That's really cool. I mean, you were saying, you were talking a lot about the illustration itself, and I was blown away by the typography.
I gotta say, Zach, that was all me. Not to brag, but because this is all happening over Christmas, and so Matthew's like, okay, I'm like going to be away from my computer for the next 48 hours or something. And so I like sat there like for 2 days straight, like doing the typography. And I have no experience doing this, but there was like a one of the authors I interviewed in the last few years was Theodora Goss, and I liked the way they had done the typography on her novel. And so I did something sort of similar to that, and I just kept messing with it and messing with it and messing with it. And I'm not that good at Photoshop, so it was like it didn't look polished, but it was like exactly the thing with the, these letters are going to get bigger and these letters are going to get smaller, then this is going to be at an angle here. And so I said that to Matthew, and then he did it like real, with like real fonts and stuff, and he sent it back to me. I was like, holy shit, this looks so cool. I was just ecstatic with how the title turned out.
Yeah, it's so I was surprised what you did that in Photoshop. That looks like it was done in Illustrator. Yeah, it's pretty great.
Well, my version was done. My version was done in GIMP, and I had to learn how to do how to use the rotate and gradient tools, because I never used those before. So it was a big learning experience for me. But yeah, I think the way the cover turned out, I think it's super cool and super eye catching, and like. In this book, it's like such a, I think, and we, I haven't seen the actual physical book yet, because we're just still doing finalizing the layout now. But I just have to imagine this is going to be such a cool physical object. I think anyone is going to want, because it's like, this is my first book. It's like the first book from Geek's Guide Press, which I guess I should get into in a little bit. And so I don't know. I think it's a piece of history here. I think it's going to be a super cool physical object. I can't say enough about how excited I am to hold a copy in my hands.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a question or two about the stories and about how you? Okay, thank you. So are you a huge fan of? I mean, I know I am, but reading this, I was struck by. I don't know. Are you a huge fan of older science fiction, from the 50s, 60s, and 70s? I know you are with Amber, but I'm wondering about other short stories and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, because my parents are both big science fiction fans, and that's how I got into it. And so they read me, all the stuff I read growing up was basically stuff that they passed down to me. So yeah, and so that was stuff that mostly had been published in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
I don't think I ever knew that about you, but I am I love that kind of science fiction too. But reading these stories, I was struck by how similar they are to a lot of the really fun science fiction and fantasy stories I read that were written back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where this stuff was I was like, wow, so much of this stuff is so similar to Robert Sheckley stories or old Zelazny stories, or just the really old classic Ray Bradbury and that kind of vein.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned Roger Zelazny's Amber series is my favorite series, and I've read some of those books literally 50 times, and so that's definitely the biggest stylistic influence on me. But I've always really liked short stories that are and I think all the stories in this book, every scene progresses the plot, everything has it's always driving, as you said, towards some I always know what the ending is, and then everything that happens almost sentence by sentence is all building up to the ending, is setting up something that needs to happen to make the ending happen. So yeah, I think it has that sort of classic stuff happens, Twilight Zone, golden age science fiction kind of thing. Yeah
it really does have that
ontological factor.
Scene,
that's the one where I'm man, this is the classic. I like it. It's not my favorite one, but it's that one. And then the one, the They Go Bump. I was thinking is Dave you? I know you weren't inspired by these, but and I know you don't even like these things, but those social deduction games where it just ends up people shouting in a room hey, you're the bad guy. No, you're the bad guy. And everyone has secret roles. With those two, I was feeling that kind of
Mafia. I think there's one called Mafia.
Mafia.
It's a card game. Where,
yeah, I was like, it was like I was experiencing that. Like I was like in both of those and in different ways, kind of. Like in more of the cerebral
but it also,
sense, I guess. And
They Go Bump also reminds me of if you watch the movie The Thing, and then you watch like I'm talking the one with Kurt Russell, and then you watch the one from like the 1950s or whatever it is, the original The Thing, where they like, it's just goofy. It's like a Frankenstein monster that's thawed out of the ice. And then you go back and you're like, well, what was the original? Oh, this was based on a short story. Well, what was that short story like? And then you go back and read that short story and you're like, holy cow, it's nothing like the one that they made, the movie they made in the 50s or 60s, because they just couldn't do it then. They didn't have the special effects. But then the John Carpenter version that came out in the 80s is like really faithful to the old story that came out in like I don't know what it was, the 40s or 50s.
Yeah.
and, Who Goes There? It's like 1910.
Very good. I was on the tip of my tongue. Thank you. But when I read They Go Bump, I was like, it's so similar to that. It's so similar to like the script of the original Alien. It's so similar to so many of those old like 1950s and 60s paranoia, we're afraid of the Soviet Union stories. But it's so cool. And when you said in the author note that it's like you had been approached about making it into a movie by like some really established producer. Who was it again, Dave?
Well, it was it wasn't, he didn't approach me about making it into a movie, but he judged the contest that it was one of the winners, and it was Andrew Mason, who was the executive producer of The Matrix. But he said he called it a quote perfect piece of writing for the short story form. So
right, which I completely agree. Like when I read it, I was just like, holy cow, is this cool? And it's so tense and paranoid, and it's such a mind blower. Like it really reminds me of one of those older pieces, that one. And then the Black Bird is so much like, I wrote one of my notes, it's like and I read this story at Clarion, but I've read this story many times over the years, but it's just like a great Sheckley story almost. Then I'm trying to look real quick here. Red Road, that's just really cool. It's more like Red Wall, like you pointed out. But Save Me Please, that's also kind of in many ways similar to some of that older stuff. The Ontological Factor, like Zach pointed out, that is like a great classic old style science fiction story. And you can really see the Amber influence in it. And the Second Rad as well, which was that originally called I Can Rewind Time?
I Can Rewind Life, yeah.
I Can Rewind Life. Okay, I thought I was going nuts. I was like, I know this wasn't called The Second Rat. I remember the story though. They Go Bump, obviously.
I guess I want to just say, Tom, that They Go Bump. If you, for people listening, the premise is that there's a bunch of soldiers and they're all wearing this invisibility armor, and so they can't see. None of them can see each other, and then one of them starts becoming convinced that aliens who are also invisible are killing off his friends one by one and just imitating their voices and impersonating them. And so it's this really sort of paranoid kind of story. And yeah, it's definitely 100% influenced by John W. Campbell's story, Who Goes There? Cool. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I guess some of these, like, I'm thinking, like, I didn't even put some of this stuff in the author's notes because it's like so obvious to me that it didn't even occur to me, like, oh, people wouldn't realize. But in a lot of the author's notes, I did put like, oh, this is, because I just love science fiction so much, and so I just want, a lot of these stories are like, oh, I love this thing so much, and I want to do something, that recalls that or like pushes that one step farther, or at least is going to make people, that hopefully people are going to like it for the same reasons that I liked this thing that I read when I was a kid, or that I read, as in college or whatever.
Tom, you were right about to say the prize, and I was thinking that's actually, to me, it felt way more like cyberpunk. Like it felt more like an 80s story. And I wanted to ask about that. So in the note, you said Jim Shooter did a treatment on that for a comic book?
Yeah. For a movie.
So did you get to see that treatment, or was there any panels or any kind of like pencils or anything like that?
I did have at one. I don't know if I still have it, but I did have the treatment, but it was just text. There was no a concept art or anything.
Oh man, that is so wild. Like, I mean, I can't believe that. Like when I read that, I was like, that is legendary. I mean, Jim Shooter,
the action is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that would have made a great comic or a great
explain, Zach, who Jim Shooter is if people don't know.
Okay, so Jim Shooter was the editor of Marvel after, I believe it was right after Stan Lee, and he was an editor probably from the mid 70s to the early 80s at Marvel, and he started writing comics when he was like literally like 13 years old. He's a legend, like a legend in comics fandom. So
Oh wow.
yeah, so him having anything like having to done a treatment on your work is like, man, that is like completely mind-blowing. And he still I think he created he created some newer stuff as well. Once he left Marvel, he went on to make Valiant, I believe, and then I think he sold that eventually. He's not the publisher there anymore, but yeah, I mean, he still works. He's still a comic guy.
It was super cool because there was this thing called the Phobos Fiction Contest, and there was a woman, Sandra Schulberg, who's a Hollywood producer, who kind of she started a company and started the contest, and so they were very well connected. And so the idea was kind of to have this short fiction contest and then take the short stories that won and try to turn them into movies and video games and stuff like that. And so They Go Bump was one of the top three winning stories the first year. And unfortunately, as far as I know, none of the things ever actually did get turned into a movie or a video game or anything. But it was really cool because the contest was judged by all these famous people, and I got to meet a lot of them. And I was like 23 or something at the time, and so it was just it was just super cool. So yeah, I want to get John back in here too. John, anything you've been dying? I mean, you've had plenty of opportunities to talk to me over the years, but
sure.
Anything you're dying to, or anything you want to say about the book or ask me or anything?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, in terms of, we were talking about there was some discussion of our favorites. I mean, I think Dave, that The Blackbird and Veil of Ignorance are like my two favorite stories of yours. Those are both just such great stories. I mean, as we've been discussing, there's a lot of stories that are just really awesome in here. But I mean, like The Blackbird and Veil of Ignorance just seem like really next level to me. Like they do exactly what I want out of, science fiction and fantasy stories. Just like they're so complex and like well thought out, and like it's like I get like a complete emotional experience reading the thing, and my mind is being sort of every brain cell is being sort of agitated and in a good way, because it's like there's so much going on, and it's like I was actually just getting chills just thinking about some of the moments of the stories. So yeah, I mean those stories are just like the top tier for me.
Oh, those are two of my favorites also.
I meant to say that the Veil of Ignorance, that's the one where a group of friends experiment with the mind, the alien drug, where they don't know who they are. So that was the one that I meant to pair with They Go Bumps. Sorry, I screwed that up. But yeah, the Veil of Ignorance, that's the classic one for me, where I was like, oh man, like you don't know who you are. Like it's so confusing. And to me, that's the game where you're playing like, Mafia or Secret Hitler or whatever.
Okay. I can see that. I wrote a note in there that it was like that one also is like a Lost Sheckley story. It was so much fun. I had never read that one before, and it was so much fun reading it. I felt like I was literally reading a Lost Sheckley story. And it's so cool how it like starts out with something that's really a sound like philosophical idea that you took from somewhere else and then dramatized it. I thought that was really fun. And that's where I was also shocked by sort of how similar our tastes in short fiction are. When I read that, I was just like, wow, this is like, I'm jealous that I didn't write this. It's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, at some point after, I think it was when I reprinted Veil of Ignorance and Lightspeed, I had said to you, Dave, that, it's like, hey, could you write more stories that are like inspired by this sort of philosophical concept like this? And because it was like, I love that. I mean, I think you talked about it in the author note, right? But
well, because I studied like political theory constitutional law in college. And so, yeah, just in one of my econ law classes, we read this book called Political Liberalism by John Rawls. And that's because he had this idea that he called the veil of ignorance, which was basically like, we should think about how to make a fair society by thinking about what would rational people agree to if they didn't know who they were going to be in the society, if they didn't know, if they were going to be rich or poor or male or female or whatever. And so I sort of took that as a starting point for this story that goes in a pretty different direction ultimately.
It's interesting. You were saying that you built like every story, you knew where it was going. And with that, it was like the things that happen in that story, it's not just the concept. Like it is, I feel like a lot of writers would have been like, all right, this is a cool concept, and then I'm done. But shit goes down in that story. I don't want to spoil, but it's fucked up. And it's like not what you're like, oh no, I'm a rational person. This is not what people would do. And it's like, nah, people are idiots, and they would do this shit, They like it would awesome. It would go down like that after these last couple of years. I'm like, yeah, this is how exactly this would go down.
Yeah, all you people out there listening to this, you're a fucking idiot. You should buy this book. And subscribe and like.
Well, present company accepted, including the listeners. They're accepted as well. It's the other people who don't listen to this show.
Let me just say though that because I came across that idea in class in 99 or 2000 probably, and then I didn't write the story until 2003. So I was thinking about it for 4 years or something before I wrote it. So yeah, like. And that's like Tom was saying, like that makes you less prolific if you spend 4 years thinking about a story before you write it. But, sometimes you just have to think about something for that long for all the pieces to fall into place. And, although actually the end, as I say in the author's note too, though, except then I came up with the new ending in one day. So maybe I could have saved myself some time somehow, but.
I mean, that timeline sort of works for Ted Chiang, right? I mean, so he famously sort of is a very sort of ponderous writer where, he likewise spends a lot of time thinking about all these stories. And so, his output is very low, but then it's like, everyone's an event when it comes out. It's like, oh, yes, new Ted Chiang story, like that kind of thing. And so it's like, I mean, you're in good company.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with John as well, where he says like, I missed that part in the author note apparently, but where he told you like, hey, can you write more stories that are based on philosophical concepts? And I agree with that. Like you made a comment, I think you titled the podcast episode where you talked about my short story collection. You titled it "The Best Science Fiction Humor is Existential." And I would argue that the best science fiction and fantasy stories are existential, that they have to show us something deeper about ourselves. And your stories do that. You spend the time, like I said, with, transformations. You're like, well, no, it's not. It'd be cool to write a story about a guy who really has a friendship with a living car. But let's think about like, what does it mean? What is a transformer? Like, what does the word transform mean? And like dig deeper into like, the robot ends up saying, no, you're the real transformer. Like you're the one who's actually changing here. And, that to me, it's so cool the way you take every one of your stories over into that existential realm, into like, no, we're going to really examine what this can say about us, about the reader, which is really, it really makes it all like kind of pull the reader right into the story, which I just love.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. And I mean, that's what I've always loved about science fiction is the thought experiment aspect of it, that you enter into this space where the rules can be different. And then what can you learn? What can you discover about yourself or about humanity or whatever about changing the parameters and seeing what comes out of that. And so, so I think people who don't read science fiction, oftentimes they think that it's about aliens and spaceships and stuff. And like, obviously I love aliens and spaceships, but the heart of it to me is the thought experiment. The like, what if things were different? What would that mean? And what can we learn from seeing things from a different perspective? So yeah, I totally agree with that, Tom.
That's cool. Although I have to say with the skull-faced boy, I'm kind of like, I understand why it's horror, because I'm like, I don't want to see stuff like that about myself. But it's terrifying. It's really horrifying to think like, what if you became a zombie, but some people who became zombies kept their intellect, and what kind of conflict would that set up, and what would you choose? And that kind of thing. You know, I understand it's horror, so it has to kind of ask questions that are maybe a little more painful or a little more, you know, horrifying. But it works in that sense too. It's a really fun story. You wrote that. Did I read that also at Clarion, or was it shortly after
No,
Clarion?
it was after. It was right after I graduated from college that I wrote that.
Okay.
So yeah, like a year or two after Clarion.
Okay. Am I like one of the characters in that story? I don't want to be like egotistical, but it sounded like you're like, oh yeah, he drives up. You know, you live in Waterville. That's your hometown. I'm like, well, that's my hometown, and I'm sure not, but
Well, I was gonna say, well, because Colby's in Waterville, so I lived there for 4 years. So it wasn't necessarily all about you, Tom, but I don't know. I never thought about that before.
Did you make friends with anybody else from Waterville though? Because most Colby kids don't. They kind of
I don't think so. I don't think so. So probably like the idea of someone actually living in Waterville. I probably did have you in mind, at least to some extent. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah,
I never actually thought about. I'll have to think about how much of you is in that story. But I did want to say too that I mean I have the stories separated out, and I've so it's like fantasy stories, science fiction stories, and horror stories, and I can't really think of other collections I've seen that have done that. Mm-hmm. But I really just wanted to do that mostly because like I've had some people have really strong negative reactions to some of the stuff that happens in the horror stories. So it's like, all right, well, I'll put those in the back and they're clearly labeled horror. So, it's your own fault if you go wandering back there and, it's not like it just pops up in story number 3 in the collection or something. But
as a reader, I appreciated that because I really don't like horror. Horror really terrifies me. It's supposed to, but I don't enjoy that. And, mostly, although I have to say the Skullface City, I didn't take that as horror. And I have to say, I love Stephen King. I don't really consider him horror. I think the first time I actually read a book by him, I was like, oh, it's not horror. It's an adventure story. But it's kind of like The Hobbit or, Lord of the Rings or something, but set in the modern day. And I felt like the Skullface City also, to me, was not necessarily horror. It was a really cool twist on horror where you had this character who's supposed to be the antagonist, who he's actually the protagonist. And when you start reading about him more and more, you start really siding with him, which was a fun experience. I didn't take it as like, I wasn't horrified by the story. I was more kind of intrigued or pulled along.
Cool. Zach, any other questions for me?
I was wondering if the family tree story, I mean, that's like maybe a little bit less of like a thought experiment. I feel like saying like all these stories are necessarily thought experiments, like might be doing it a little bit of disservice because there's also like, there are these characters in these moments. And I'm wondering with like Family Tree, was there, because I just so relate to getting a summon from the family and having to make an appearance. And it's like, God, I don't want to fucking go back home to this small town of these people that I don't really like hanging around with or being around. I was like wondering like, what, well, I mean, like where, like, what was the inspiration there? Did you, I don't know. I just found it super relatable.
Yeah, well. So the premise of the story is that there's this magic tree, and every time a new member of the family is born, it grows a new limb for that person to live in. And then there's this rivalry between sort of the two like sides of the family that gets increasingly like blood feudy kind of. And that's not really autobiographical at all. I mean, I'm an only child, and I have a really good relationship with my parents. And I don't know if I mentioned, but my dad actually did the layout for this book, like before we handed it off to Matthew. So no, that's all kind of out of my imagination. I mean, but like we mentioned, like the Amber series, which were my favorite books growing up. It's all about this feuding family, and the character has a nasty mother. One of the characters has a nasty mother and stuff like that. And so, yeah, that's not. I don't know if my parents are listening to this or not, but no, none of that is inspired by my family in particular.
I'd like to corroborate that.
It felt authentic.
I've met Dave's. Yeah, it really did. I thought about that too. I've met your parents on a few occasions, and they're very good-natured scientists, and Dave and they just have a really good relationship. And I often wondered, reading through this book, how you managed to, you know, being an only child, being from that dynamic, how you managed to tap into such broad dynamics between like large groups of people in some of your stories.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, at one point I did read like 100 memoirs to try to just understand how different sorts of people had lived. And, you know, it's it was a list, you know, I made, and I read 100 to just, try to understand what different people's life experiences had been like and how they saw the world and stuff like that. I mean, I certainly have had lots of shitty experiences with people, but just not my immediate family for sure. So yeah, like a lot of these stories, you know, like, I definitely drew on sort of shitty experiences I had with other people.
It's hard to believe that there are writers who like had shitty experiences with people, and then it turned out to be funneled into their stories. You know, like that's unusual, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm the first person to do that. I'm the first person to separate out the fantasy, science fiction, horror. First person to put all the illustrations in, and first person to use shitty experiences from my life in my fiction. So
hey,
it's really groundbreaking.
Well done.
Groundbreaking book.
I was going to say, I also appreciated the separation of the genres in the book, just because, you know, I like to know going into, you know, the story that, oh, this is this and this is that. And, you know, maybe sometimes I'm in the mood for one or the other. And actually, I wanted to do it in Best American, and I was overruled. So I was like, oh, okay. I thought I was a series editor, but all right, fine. Anyway.
I wanted to ask John, is that even common? Because I feel like this may be one of the only times I've seen that. I don't recall a collection or an anthology separated like that.
Yeah, it's not too common. I mean, I can't say that I've never seen it, but I can't think of an example off the top of my head where I did. I mean, there's things that do separate the genres like that. Like, you know, for instance, Lightspeed has, you know, stories that we flag as science fiction versus fantasy, so it's not like it's not labeled, it is. And then like the ebook edition, it's like we do have it, you know, like here's all the science fiction stories, here's all the fantasy stories. But I mean, in terms of collections or anthologies, you know, somebody probably did it somewhere, but I can't think of what it is. If anything, I would think it might have been some other year's best that may have done it at some point. I mean, Rich Horton for a while had a series with Prime Books that was his year's best, and it was literally like two different books. So you know, and they were part of the same overall series, so it was like kind of like he was separating them, you know, just that it's like, put it in different books.
All right, so we're almost out of time, so I want to get into things quickly. And so one is, I just want to tell this funny story, because as I was coming up with the idea for this panel, and I was talking to my girlfriend, and this is actually on the trip we drove to Santa Fe, and which is where I proposed to her, because that was where Roger Zelazny lived, and so I like proposed to her in this like mountain where it's like one of the locations from the Amber books. But so anyway, so it was on that trip, and so I was talking about my idea for this episode 500. And so the initial idea was I was just going to have one person interview me before I had the idea to make it more of like a book party kind of thing like this. But so Steph, my girlfriend, she was like, so who are you thinking about having interview you? And I said, well, I was thinking either you or Zach Chapman. And she says, oh, you should get Zach. He loves you.
Wow.
Was that before or after you proposed?
You're like maybe I gave the ring to the wrong person.
It was on that trip where I proposed to her, so it was just really funny. So I just wanted to mention that. But then before we run out of time, I also want to talk about Geek's Guide Press. So as I said, this is the first book from Geek's Guide Press, which is like, it's just me, you know, at the moment. But you know, like I was saying, like when I saw how well Tom's book did, I was like, oh well, if my book did as well, that would make enough money that I could, you know, as I said, put out another book or 2 books or something. And so, so I might do another collection of my own work, but then I also want to put out books by like some of the regulars on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And I figured that can be like the, you know, sort of the brand of Geek's Guide Press, or sort of the, you know, what would make it a viable business proposition is if there's this built-in audience of people who are like, oh, I know all these people from the podcast and I want to read what kind of fiction they write. And so the other idea, like if this is successful, that I had in mind was to maybe do like a Geek's Guide anthology, where it's like all the people who've appeared the most on the show, and then you would have like maybe their best story, or like that they would select their best story or something.
Cool.
And then those would all be in the book. And then I thought, like, because I had so much fun doing like the art and cover design and stuff for this, I was trying to think of like something that would make it stand out. We would maybe have like little essays from the contributors, like funny stories about like experiences that they've had at conventions or like on the show, or like interacting with authors or things like that. And then also I thought it would be really cool to have like pages throughout the books where there's like caricatures of the authors. So, there would be like 5 people all like, and it's like done in sort of like a Star Trek kind of milieu or something. And then like, so if there were 20 contributors, there would be like 4 pages like that throughout the book, where each one had 5 of the people all like posing with swords or like phasers and stuff like that. I think that would be really cool.
Nice.
And obviously I would have to make a certain amount of money to like to hire someone to do all that. But I don't know. Those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. And I just feel like John and I, like, I think like if you listen to this show, I think we have, we know a lot about science fiction, and we know a lot of cool people, and I think we have good taste and everything. And so, if you want us to be in a position where we're like calling the shots, because like so many things, obviously John publishes a lot of books, but so many times, I would send John something that I read and be like, oh, this should be published, and he's like, oh, I wanted to publish that, but like, the publisher didn't want to do it. And just like, if we could be in a position where like we're the ones making those decisions, because I think we're the, like we know the science fiction the best, like I just think that would be really cool. So if you like, if that sounds good to you, if you want us to have more ability to get more stuff into print, buy my book. And again, it's called Save Me Please and Other Stories, available now on Amazon.com. Like the more books I sell, the more I'll, John and I will be able to, get to be able to make those decisions and decide, what else gets published. So yeah,
I think that's a great idea, and I have to chime in and say I don't think you'll be sorry if you buy the book. I was I haven't read a lot of short stories in the past maybe 10 years. I've kind of been out of it, and I have to read for work. I'm an editor of nonfiction, and so I have to read a lot. And so when it comes time to like relax, I don't really enjoy reading short fiction. So I was kind of like, okay, well, I love Dave. I'm going to read this. And, you can tell Steph that, by the way, if you want. But I was like, I'm going to read this, anthology. But I was surprised how much I enjoyed it. It was really like every story was a ton of fun. So I think if you do buy it, you're not going to be let down at all.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Yeah. And I think like, and I had to read this book just in the editing process. I had to I read it a couple times in one day, each. And like, I think like, and that's just the way I write, I think, is that, there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of action. There's not really any wasted. I mean, there's never like a scene that's like, you're like, what is this scene doing here? This isn't advancing the story or anything. Like everything is pulling you through the story. And so like everything is pulling you through the whole book, I think. And so like, yeah, if that's the kind of fiction that appeals to you, like there's like cool stuff happening like practically on every page. This is the book for you, I think.
Oh, and it has something. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, then pick up the freaking book, because it has everything that that this podcast is about. Maybe you listen to this podcast because you like science fiction, you don't like fantasy. Well, it's already separated for you. You can just read the science fiction. You can just read the horror if you're a horror nut. Or, like John was saying, you could skip around. Fully endorsed.
And one of the cool things about publishing on Amazon as well is that, and which is what Dave is doing, is that there was one of the listeners for the episode where we talked about my collection asked Dave, can I read some of the story? I don't want to like spend, any money unless I know I'm going to enjoy it. Can I read some of the stories first? And so Dave asked me, and I was like, well, yeah, Amazon lets you go to the look inside thing on Amazon, you click it, you can read like the first 3 stories. So you can read Beauty and the Blackbird and Seven Brothers Cruel, I think probably, which are all really good stories. And I think that will, you do that for free. So I think that will help you make up your mind.
Yeah, and I mean several of these stories, I published in Lightspeed.
No, don't tell them that. They have to buy the book.
Right. Well, if they want a sample, it's not got all of them. It's only to buy the book if they want to read all of them. I mean, honestly, Tom and Zach are giving you all the reasons you should buy it. Personally, I'm not really a fan of the author or the book, so I don't know that you really should spend your heart. No, I'm kidding, obviously, but yeah, I mean, we've given you all the reasons to buy it all along, and like Zach was saying, I mean, if you're a fan of Geek's Guide, check it out. You got to know where this guy came from after all this time listening to him yammer with all these people. He's smart.
Well, let me just, in case people didn't catch it, because I cut you off there, John, that yes, a bunch of the stories you could read on Lightspeed for free. So,
but I wouldn't say, that I think we sort of sound like an infomercial here. Like we're like, please buy this book. Here's another great reason. And you also get, but I think of the reason why we're doing it though. We're doing this because we've known Dave for a long time. We know his fiction. We think it's awesome. We think you're going to enjoy it. And we think, obviously what a great thing if it did turn into like the Geek's Guide Press, where suddenly there's this like anthology that comes out like once a year or something that Dave and John edit, would be really cool. I almost swore on your show, Dave, which I think is fine, but but I think it would be really cool. So definitely something worth supporting.
I'll also just say, like, another selling point, I think, for if you're a writer, is that, like I said, there's 18,000 words in this book about how I came up with the ideas for these stories and like what my experiences were submitting them to magazines and getting them published and all this kind of stuff. And so, like I read something like 50 books about how to write. And then you can actually just see like what actual like 5 or 6 pieces of advice actually turned out to be useful to me in my writing, in my writing career that actually, influenced how the stories came out. And you can just read this book and find out those 5 or 6 things and save yourself the trouble of reading those 50 books like I did.
It was very insightful commentary, and I it made me want to write. It made me want to write fiction. I was reading all this stuff and I was like, oh yeah, I should try that. That's such good advice.
One thing, just in terms of like Dave's devotion to the craft, I would say, like one of the things that always struck me that is really impressive is how, you had written a story or you had workshopped some stories and somebody had said that, they didn't think that you were capturing women characters properly. And so you devoted a huge chunk of time to like reading all of these different memoirs and like, by women so that you could, maybe better reflect that in your fiction. And so like, I was always really impressed by that because that was a huge project. Assuming that you don't mind sharing that. I don't remember if you mentioned it in the book or not.
I didn't, but no, yeah, I read. Well, I mentioned that I read all the memoirs. Yeah, like 80. I read 80 memoirs by women specifically for that little project. Yeah.
Yeah. Every time Dave tells me how he prepares for like writing a certain type of story, it's always exhausting. I listen to it. I'm like, holy cow! I can't compete with it. I can never. Like the amount of work and thought and research you put into stuff is mind blowing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll say like my process for a lot of them is, I would write sort of like a treatment almost, like here's what's going to happen in the story and here's like some of the best lines of dialogue and just like keep going over that for week after week after week and like adding stuff and taking stuff out and making it better and cool. And doing drawings of the characters and stuff like that. So yeah, and then like if you want to talk about how crazy I am, like one of the things I did was just like there was a period of time where I was just copying out books. Just to study how they were written, and it was like long.
I remember that,
like James Joyce's
Game of Thrones.
Ulysses. Yeah, Game of Thrones. I did. Marcel Proust's Swan's Way. I did. So like some of the biggest, kind of most densely written books.
But explain why you did that, because that sounds like until you know the logic behind it, it sounds kind of ridiculous. But say why you did it.
Well, because it's like if you're a painter, what they say you should do is like sit in the museum and copy out the works of the great masters and see how they did it. And so I thought, I could do that for writing, and because a lot of times when you're reading, if you're just reading a book, if the book is good, usually you're not really noticing like how long are the sentences or like where's the punctuation marks.
Right.
You fall into the world of the story. But if you sit there like and you spend all day like copying out a chapter, then you're nothing is going nothing is going by you. You're
Right.
noticing every comma, every semicolon and everything, you know.
Yeah, you know,
and it sounded like such a good idea that I was like, I'm going to do it too. And I got about 2 chapters into that project, and I was like, I don't know, I can't do this.
Yeah, so I mean, I never did that, but I did have to transcribe some stories back in the day that, you know, we just needed to have a digital form. And so I was taking a short story, like it was something that Gordon Van Gelder needed for an anthology he was doing. And so I had to like type out this story, and it was really interesting. Like, I think it was probably similar to what you were doing in that it's like, oh, wow, like I had read this story before, but it's like having to sit there and like actually, you know, transcribe every word into this new document. It really did make you think about everything, like you were saying. So yeah, I mean, I totally get it. And again, that's another really like very impressive thing that you did to improve the craft. So kudos.
Yeah. Okay, so I know John has to go, and we're out of time. I think I might do another one of these sometime. If people like this, we can come back and maybe talk more about some of the stories, you know, and have a spoiler episode, just because people will have had time to read the book by then and stuff. But thanks so much, you guys, for doing this. This has been super fun. And again, everyone, like, please, I love this book. I love this book so much. Please buy it. It's called Save Me, Please, and Other Stories, and it's available right now on Amazon.com. So everyone go check it out. But we need to wrap things up there. So thank you so much to John Joseph Adams, Tom Grenzer, and Zach Chapman.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me on.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to John Joseph Adams, Tom Grenzer, and Zach Chapman for joining us on the show. And again, the book is called Save Me, Please, and Other Stories by David Barr Kirtley, and it's available now on Amazon.com. And that's Save Me, Please, with please spelled PLZ. I also want to thank all our patrons whose support has made it possible for us to produce 500 episodes of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. As always, you can support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks, or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.